Morning, and thanks for having me here. So I run the Digital Government Unit at Policy Exchange. Policy Exchange is a think tank based in Westminster. We are an independent organisation formally set up as a charity, which means we're non-partisan, and we do public policy research across a whole range of topics from housing and transport through to social policy and education. I look after anything at Policy Exchange that touches technology or data or the internet. And what I thought I'd do this morning is give you a quick tour through some of the work that we've done around data, analytics, entrepreneurship, and try and give you a bit of context for the rest of the discussions this morning and this afternoon. So this is going to be highly non-technical, and I guess the spirit is the kind of conversations that I pitch to ministers and politicians when I'm trying to explain the area that that we're dealing with in our day-to-day lives. So there we are. So topics for this first session. Just a bit of context on how much data there is out there. This will be very familiar to many of you, so I won't dwell too long on that. Talk a bit about some of the opportunities that we've seen around data and analytics in the context of conversations with politicians and policymakers about using it to help with the kind of challenges that they face. Then make the bridge to data and openness for innovation and growth. Talk a bit about how that fits in the wider debate about the digital economy, and then touch on creativity, certainty, and copyright, which hopefully will tee you up for some of the deeper discussions later on. So first up, data. Now, when we did some work looking at the quantity of data in the world middle of last year, the best estimate that we could get a handle on was that there was around about 2.5 zettabytes. That's if you sum across all of the hard drives, memory sticks, mobile phones, and so on and so on. And growing at a compound annual growth rate of around 50%. And when I go and talk to people about this and they say, I have no idea what a zettabyte is, I say a zettabyte is 1 trillion gigabytes, and they say, I still don't know what that is. And one way that we talk about this is if you were to get, well, it's quite difficult to do literally, right? But if you were to get 2.5 zettabytes and burn it onto DVD-ROMs, take them out of their cases and just put the discs on the floor and start stacking them up, the stack of DVDs goes from the surface of the Earth all the way to the moon, and then it turns around and it comes halfway back. It's a pretty long way. It's a lot of data. It's more really than anyone can actually wrap their head around. What does that mean for people thinking about data in a policy context? We suggested there were really 5 big classes of opportunity here. So I'll tell you a little bit about each of these. I'm sure many of you will know about lots of these in tremendous depth. But to give you the overview, the first is about sharing in order to, I guess, make things easier, right? So we've put on here save time, save paper, save money. Modern technology and data technologies allow you to do things like, in the context of text and data mining, have computers and algorithms work their way through large quantities of information that a human being could, in principle, ingest and synthesize, except it would take many thousands of times longer to deal with very large quantities of data. In a government context, there are places in the system where actually pulling data from one system and connecting it to another system enables you to not ask a citizen for the same data twice. So in the UK, some people are fortunate enough, under certain circumstances, when renewing their driving license, it's possible to pull their electronic signature and photograph from their electronic passport record, pre-populate the driving license, and not require someone to send in another piece of information. And although that's quite a small thing, people tend to like that because it makes their lives easier and faster. So that's first. Second is about using data to learn what's happening inside a business or an organization or a particular field of interest or study in great detail and learn about it very, very fast. So the examples that we talk about here are things like, if you imagine like a modern supermarket, you could probably call the CEO of Sainsbury's or Tesco or whoever it was, and ask them, could you tell me how many of each SKU have you got on each shelf in each of your stores right now? And with a bit of luck, they could probably get pretty close to the answer pretty fast based on their systems. And there's a big contrast between that and what we often find in parts of the public sector in the UK anyway, which is that if you ask the question, how many people work in department for X, and what are they up to, and what does the org chart look like? Many times the answer is, well, we couldn't tell you that right away. Give us a couple of weeks to think about it. Maybe we could patch some different data together. And clearly you can't necessarily run a government department like a supermarket. And there are plenty of other instances where you wouldn't want to go that far, but there are things that you can do with data that help you understand more about what's going on. The third thing is about personalization. So this is this idea that actually if you have a lot of granular data about a subject or about individuals, you can start to tailor what you show to people. A classic example here is Facebook newsfeed, which doesn't just show you an unfiltered stream of everything that your friends are doing, but actually tries to curate that for you. Some people would say that is good because it helps you find helps surface the things that are going to be most interesting to you. Some people would say that's really creepy, that Facebook is learning a lot about you and who your friends are and what it thinks you would like to see. There's a whole side conversation we could have about filter bubble effects and echo chamber and what does this do when the internet only shows us things that a large corporation has decided that we want to see. But nonetheless, this is happening. Fourth, and I think this is one of the most exciting ones, is about starting to solve problems that weren't possible to solve when we didn't have access to modern technology and computational techniques. Some of this is simply about ingesting quantities of data that you could never handle working on paper, but you can handle with machines and machine learning. Some of this is about solving classes of problems that go slightly beyond just the sort of simple text and data matching, right? So one of the examples that I've heard talked about here is around the problems that eBay has trying to deduplicate its listings, right? So people often try to post the same item on eBay multiple times in order to try to game the auction process. And once upon a time, when that was just a text description of an item, it's quite easy to detect the duplicates and remove them, right? When eBay carries photographs, that process is still quite easy if someone posts the same listing twice and the photograph is the same both times, right? Because you can just match the images. But what happens if someone takes a photograph of the same object from a slightly different angle under slightly different lighting? And this is the sort of problem which actually you or I could look at that and tell straight away that it's the same product. At a point in the past, actually, that was quite a difficult problem for a computer to solve. But with modern data processing techniques, actually, that's something which is quite feasible to do now and helps that business optimize their activities. And then in the same vein, this point about predicting the future, that actually armed with enough data, there are some domains where we can start to make very good, very precise forecasts about the way a system will evolve. And we can't do this for all systems in all circumstances, but there are areas where we have now got very good at saying, given the conditions that we observe and given the granularity of the data that we've got access to, I am reasonably confident that if I take the following actions, the system will evolve in this way. For policymakers, that's very, very interesting. Clearly, in lots of scientific fields, that's an interesting development, and one which I hope, with the right investments, can do a lot more in terms of good for policymakers and in the wider economy. And the final reason that we tell ministers this area is interesting is because this activity around data, analytics, and so on has enormous potential for the productivity and growth story in the UK. Some of this is about actually direct government investment in these fields. If the government wants to take advantage of high-performance analytics, probably requires some partnerships with industry. And that's an interesting addition to the way government is investing and thinking about its industrial strategy in the UK. But there's this broader point around investing in this area and technology, data, computer science skills more generally as a foundation for future economic growth and prosperity. I've put in here a couple of examples that we use when we're talking about why it is that data and analytics has so much potential. The first of these is about healthcare and prescribing. So some of you may be familiar with a piece of work that was done recently in the UK called Prescribing Analytics. So this was Ben Goldacre, a big data startup called Mastodon C, which is just down the road in Tech City somewhere, the Open Data Institute and Open Healthcare UK. And what they did was they looked at the way that the doctors in the NHS in England and Wales prescribe statins, which are the drugs for a certain type of heart condition and cholesterol. And what we know is that when doctors prescribe statins, they can choose branded pharmaceuticals or they can choose generics. The generics are unsurprisingly cheaper. You can't always prescribe the generics rather than the branded drugs because there are sometimes interactions with other drugs that people are taking. But what this group did was that they got hold of the guidelines, the clinical guidelines on when it was appropriate to prescribe different sorts of drugs. They got hold of the open data on GP prescription behaviour and NHS prescription behaviour for England and Wales. And they combined that together and asked the question of the data, in what circumstances, out of all of these prescription events, in how many of those would it be appropriate to switch a patient from the branded drugs to the generic drugs and do that without any impact on clinical efficacy, i.e. in line with the guidelines. So you process, in this case, many millions of lines of NHS prescription data, and you try and understand the differences in the cost of the drugs. And the answer is, if you were to switch patients from branded to generic statins, in the cases where it would be in line with the guidelines, you would save the NHS in the UK £200 million a year. £200 million a year for one class of drugs. It's astonishing, right? That's the power of this level of analysis. And actually what I've described isn't that sophisticated an analysis to do, right? It's a lot of data, but it's not a particularly sophisticated algorithm required to process it. But it's interesting that that kind of money is being left on the table because we haven't built up our capability to do that routinely. We haven't built up our capability to ask that sort of question as a matter of course. Another example, which is live at the moment, is this debate about the future of the census in the UK. So here's what the legislation looks like from 1920, well, the front page anyway. So the UK runs a census which happens once every 10 years. It's largely paper-based, although some of it was done on the internet in the last census in 2011. It's interesting because we survey everybody in the population. So 32 sheets of paper come through the door of every single household. It takes the Office for National Statistics well over a year to process that data before they can give you the first round of preliminary results. Costs a lot of money. It costs something like £480 million every time we run the census in the UK. And the ONS are consulting right now on the future of the census. And the options they've got on the table are, number one, do it broadly the same, but with much heavier internet focus. Right? So go from 16% of people returning online to a much higher number and refine it slightly that way. Or the second is, should we borrow the approach that many of our European neighbours use, which is rather than attempt to survey the entire population once every 10 years, we will use data and analytics tools to fuse together existing population registers in order to build up this patchwork into an understanding of how many people there are in the country and their attributes. And if we need to, we will top that up with surveys that don't sample the whole population, but sample enough of the population to be representative. And there's arguments for and against, and there's clearly in the UK an interesting question about how expensive it is to make the transition. Because in other countries where you do this, of course, for many years, we've been running systems that produce data in a format that's amenable to this. But it's a live question. It's one where there's the potential to save a lot of money if it's done right. On the other hand, there is this point about, well, will I lose the continuity with the historical data? So this one not resolved, but I think really, really interesting. Now, those are both very public sector oriented. Thinking about the economy more broadly, this is David Willits. He's the UK Minister for Universities and Science at the Department for Business. And he is clutching a copy of a pamphlet that he published with Policy Exchange called 8 Great Technologies, which was about the future of the British economy and what are the science and technology areas where the UK should be thinking about trying to build up some kind of advantage. And it's obviously a little bit dangerous to be thinking about picking winners, but he would say, government has to pick something, and here's our best sense of what these areas might be. And we don't expect them to all be right, but you've got to choose something. And so in the list of 8 great technologies are things like advanced robotics, satellite technology, biosciences and life sciences. But on his list is big data and green computing. So it's one of the 8 areas that the UK government thinks is going to be fundamentally important to the future of the British economy, which is interesting in and of itself that he would put it up there. And when it comes to thinking about the digital economy more broadly, this chart comes from a bit of work done by NISA and a company called Growth Intelligence to try and understand how important digital is to the British economy. And what they were interested in was, is the way that we've traditionally counted businesses still right? And what's kind of cool is they use big data to answer the question, right? So all the old data sets require businesses to classify themselves on this taxonomy of what does your business do. But that taxonomy was written a fairly long time ago and doesn't reflect a lot of the sorts of activities that digital businesses and businesses that use digital now describe themselves as. So what Growth Intelligence do is they crawl the web, right? Because actually any business that has some digital in its operations or in the way that it interacts with customers tends to leave a trail online. And if you hoover enough of that up, you can start to build up a picture of all the entities and their relationships and what are they doing. And what they found was there were more digital businesses in the country than the official statistics said. So 14.5% versus 10%. And they accounted for twice as much employment than the official statistics said. Which is interesting and which goes to this point around actually, we tend to think of, or we tend to describe in policy debates the internet and digital like it's a special sector of the economy, right? Like oil or manufacturing. But actually, I think we're heading much more to a world where many, if not ultimately all businesses will be digital to some extent. Right? The only question is how much? Actually, it's a general purpose technology that crosses all of these boundaries rather than being able to say we need a special digital strategy over here for digital businesses and then we need all this other stuff for other firms. So this is a great report. You can pull a copy of that off the web if you're interested. Now, this is a chart that comes from some work that we did last summer on high-tech startups and entrepreneurship and the future of the digital economy in Britain. And one of the things that we did was we had a look at the data on the world's top privately held digital businesses, right? So Google and Facebook and others are not in this list. But if you pull out the top 100 or so and ask where in the world are they, the answer, whilst not surprising, is still quite striking, which is they're in America. So of the top 103, 82 are in the United States, 4 in the UK, 4 in China, and so on. The British businesses in this list are people like Wonga, Mind Candy, Shazam. If you look at the Americans, course, with that number, it's all sorts of things. Where in America are they? Of that 82, more than half are in California, a large chunk in New York, and the others spread around, right? So when we were doing this work last year, it makes you think a priori there's something interesting happening in the States and in Silicon Valley and in California. And it's not to say that one would want to or be able to simply copy and paste all of the American rules and culture and norms and everything into the UK or into Europe. It's clearly not possible, but it is instructive to try to understand what's happening here that makes this such a large contrast, and what could we learn from it, and what pieces of the story would we like to pick up. And when we structured this in the report, which again you can find on the web, we pulled out, for sake of argument, 6 things to think about. Skills, which is not just computer science skills, but it's actually general data literacy, numeracy skills, analysis skills, ability to ask insightful questions, and how that is done not just in schools and universities, but also in the workplace. Second, something about ambition. So lots of the American entrepreneurs that we spoke to, and when you look at the mission statements of large American internet businesses, they all talk about changing the world, right? Or exiting at valuations that is eye-wateringly high. Whereas when we talked to a lot of the Brits and Europeans in this space, yes, they wanted to do well and succeed, but there wasn't quite this ambition and confidence that the thing they were doing would be the greatest thing mankind had ever seen. Which, maybe the Americans are too bold, but there's something in there. Some points about finance and this whole question about debt and equity and the ladder for getting your startup from seed funding all the way through to scale and IPO. Some points about mentoring and the relationship between different businesses and individuals in the ecosystem. Some stuff about agility, like how quickly could you pivot your business? What about the ease or not with which you could hire staff, fire staff? Yep. And then the last one was about the rules around creativity and copyright. So particularly in this world of digital and user-generated content and businesses built off the back of analytics and machine learning and so on, the regime and the certainty or lack of certainty around the regime was pivotally important. So this is the thoughts that I'll leave you with when we talk to people about the copyright issues. My favorite quote, which is now quite old, but from Bruce Schneier, trying to make digital files uncopyable is like trying to make water not wet, which I kind of like. The point being, of course, that this idea that one person has data, therefore somebody else can't have the data at the same time is obviously, you understand this, right, is miles past its sell-by days. And it requires you to think very differently about copyright and notions of ownership and sharing and so on. And in our discussion with people working in this space and trying to build businesses in this space, what they told us above everything else was, yes, we'd like it all reformed in a particular direction, but more important than that, when I've got investors on a bottom line, is I need to have some certainty. Even if that certainty doesn't go quite the way that I'd like it to, at least then I know where I stand and I can get on with it. In a world where it's very uncertain, where the rules keep being in flux, where government commissions reviews, implements half of the recommendations, dithers on the other half, then has another review, if I have got a brilliant idea and I want to get it off the ground, but I know that all of my seed funding is going to be eaten by legal fees and dispute resolution and so on, it's not a happy place to be. And we concluded our report with a little bit of we had this sort of parting thought in here about fair use and how it is fundamentally we think about this. And is the right way now, like sitting here in 2013, is the right way to think about fair use as an exception to copyright? Or is fair use a right that the user has on a level with the rights of the creator. And we leave that as a question rather than something that we think we've got a solution to. But in a world of, as I say, user-generated content, lots of large businesses being built off the back of that, I think it's an interesting question to ponder. Okay, so that's it from me. I hope that's some useful context for the broader debate. You can find all of the reports that I've described on our website. So if you Google or Bing or whatever Policy Exchange, you'll find us. That's my Twitter handle. Very happy to take a couple of questions now if people want to. And of course, track me down online afterwards if you want to follow up.
You want to take the questions?
Do you have a personal opinion on your open testing? When you've obviously spoken to a lot of these businesses now, and I mean, you must have formed a...
So this one?
Yeah.
I give you my personal opinion, which maybe isn't not a house view, and it's certainly not a UK government view, but look, my read on this is if you think about how successful some of the platforms that use and reuse content have become. If you think about Pinterest, for example, right, which has become phenomenally successful, but there are very few people, let's face it, actually putting their own original content onto Pinterest, right? It's a kind of recycling of other stuff, and you add value, and it's interesting because of the interpretation, the connections, and so on that are made on top. I think that's something that we're all getting used to, right? That actually we live in this world where lots of things that we consume are mashups of other sources and are legitimate reworkings of existing content. And the evidence seems to suggest that we find that useful and valuable, and as consumers we consume it. So my sense is this world of trying to hold the copyright regime in stasis. I think you can probably hold it there for some period of time, but I don't think it's sustainable, right? I think it's a question of when rather than if, and how painful the transition is going to be. Whoa, okay. All right, go on. You two gentlemen.
Given that the US is so far ahead, but we still see restrictive copyright practices in the US, and some of the biggest restrictors are there. And when you look at some of the details of the regulations, they seem to be just as forbidding as they are here. Is it just that California doesn't care and goes ahead and does it anyway? And can we get that message over here?
Well, there's a good question. I don't know. I suspect there's something in the. It's very difficult to generalize about attitudes across entire continents, right? But we did. Some of the Americans that we spoke to and the North Americans that we spoke to would say things like, yeah, sometimes we just kind of, like you do it and you ask permission, or you ask for forgiveness, right, rather than ask for permission up front. There's some other stuff happening which isn't a part of the copyright debate, right? So there are other aspects of the way things work in California that mean you get much more flow of individuals between different businesses. You have fewer restrictions on people's employment contracts and so on, which makes it easier to quit your company and start a business in direct competition with your previous employer. So there's other things happening as well, but I think the mentality is part of it. Yeah.
Yes, I agree that I think there's definitely a rising issue on the policy agenda, the use of big data in terms of leveraging big data to improve public service delivery and public policy outcomes, as indicated by this information economy strategy. I think it's a data capability strategy coming out in October as well. But in trying to deliver these outcomes in fields like health, integrated health and social care, and criminal justice, and so on and so forth, are we going to run into the same issues with copyright, copyright exceptions and limitations that research libraries experience in terms of trying to mine the available data, and therefore is there a common cause that can be pursued?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think you're right. As more and more parts of the economy and more organisations realise that they want to get a better, deeper understanding of the data that they either sit on or they should have collected and be sitting on, then yes, I think you're right. We probably will hit some of the same issues, and like if you abstract away from some of the, like whichever sector you're in, you're right, like the approach is very similar. Okay.
I did like the last point where you asked, should XYZ be a fundamental user right? As far as I can tell, within digital sales at the moment, there's no concept at all of a user right. And if I go into Waterstones and buy a book, there's nothing that Waterstones can do to prevent me from using it as a doorstop.
Yep.
Whereas if I go out and buy an MP3 from Amazon, there is a very, very long list of conditions attached which attempt to stop me doing that sort of thing. So I guess the question is, do you think there should be is this something we need to start looking at? You know, the idea of a fundamental user right in digital materials, which we just don't have at the moment.
I think it is important to think about. Like, I don't know whether it's interesting, right? Because it's quite an abstract concept, and so whether you say it's like the top thing you should do right now versus all of the other challenges that you're here to debate, I don't know. But one of the things that struck me was, this debate now about people now passing away and thinking they've left their iTunes library to their children. And of course they haven't, because your songs on iTunes are licensed to you, the individual, and that right expires when you die. And we're going to hit more and more of those sorts of issues in people's real lives. And I think it will cause people to rethink some of this.
Or if I rob a bank and spend the money on MP3s, at that point, that might sharpen the day.
Okay, how much more time have we got?
No more time.
No more time. Very sorry. Find me online, drop me an email, call me. Love to talk further. Thank you.